You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week, and thank you so much for being part of the Hazard Ground community. Before we get started with this week's episode, reminder, get on iTunes, leave us a review and a rating, and make it a 5-star rating, well, because we know you love the podcast, and we certainly appreciate your support, but that rating helps us grow the podcast and continue to get more and more listeners and better stories for you guys to hear. So leave that rating and review for us. Get on all the social media sites, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Give us a follow there as well at Hazard Ground or at Hazard Ground Podcast. Keep up with the show, each guest each week, everything we have going on, and the big news we have coming up in the future. Also, remind you guys, get on our website, hazardground.com. Click on that Amazon banner right in the center of the homepage. Do your Amazon shopping. Whatever you need to buy, we'll get a percentage of what you spend, and then we donate that back to the charities that are featured here on the Hazard Ground Podcast. And as we've been telling you for the last couple of weeks, we're very proud of this, that we've been able to make our first donation through our partnership with Amazon from the stuff that you guys have spent through our website. So it's a big deal to us. We certainly appreciate it. I know the organizations and charities that we're donated back to, they certainly appreciate it. But it's a great way for you guys to be able to help out veterans, charities, and organizations just from your own living room, from your couch. You don't even have to get up and do anything. Again, so just go to hazardground.com, click on that Amazon banner. Also, while you're on the website, click on the sponsors tab. Check out all the sponsors that we have. Support them. They support us. You support us. It's all a big family here at the Hazard Ground, and we want to keep that going forward as we continue with all these great veteran stories. With all that said, ready for this week's episode. Joining us this week is a former first lieutenant in the Marine Corps who had a 16th-month tour of duty in Vietnam. After that, he became an author, including over 17 books, 3 memoirs. He is Phil Caputo, joining us on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Phil, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks very much for having me on the show. I guess you call it a show.
It is a show, yes.
Right?
It is a show. I also failed to mention in the open, I do want to say, you were also part of the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary, and the only reason I bring that up is because a lot of our listeners have seen that, they're aware of it, and it's just a reference point of where they can get more information on you yourself. So we'll get into all that, but start back at the beginning, Phil, and tell us why you joined the Marine Corps.
Well, there were any number of reasons. Back when I was in my late teens and 20s, of course, the draft was something that every young man had to face. And if you were 1A, which I was, you were virtually certain to be drafted into the military. And that inhibited a lot of people from employing you when you got out of high school or college. The usual question was, have you done your military service yet? So I was motivated partly by that to join, partly by the examples of the generation that had gone before me, including 3 uncles, all of whom had been in the South Pacific.
Wow.
At Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and I'm trying to remember where the third one was. Excuse me, it was 2 uncles. That's right, 2 uncles, and I had one in the Air Force, right? And so there was that example. It was just something one did back then, and you wanted to do it because you felt you were carrying on in this kind of heroic or noble tradition of people who had basically saved the world from tyranny. And then I think a third motivating factor was just a sense of restlessness and adventure. The Vietnam War, though it was going on when I joined the Marine Corps, when I went on active duty in 1964, did not at that moment involve any regular American troops. There were advisors there, but not any combat troops. So I didn't really have much of a thought about going to war as I did as just traveling and seeing the world. So I think that would sum up the threads of what motivated me to join the Marine Corps.
And so when you say you didn't really think you were ever going to go to Vietnam when you signed up?
Yeah, I didn't think so. I mean, I'm old enough to have remembered the Cuban Missile Crisis. I thought there was as good a chance I would end up in Cuba.
In Cuba, yeah.
As Vietnam, and in addition, there were a lot of tensions at that time in Southeast Asia, but not even necessarily in Vietnam. There was one in Laos.
Yeah, Cambodia and everything else, right?
Cambodia and all of that, and so there was some possibility of ending up there, not necessarily in a big shooting war, but in some kind of combat capacity.
When you look back on it,
I didn't really think that much about Vietnam. Matter of fact, to tell you the truth, I think I, like my parents, had only the fuzziest notion of where Vietnam was.
When you look back on it, do you feel like it was naivete to think that you wouldn't go?
No, not really. No. If I was naive, then so was about 90% of the country. I mean, don't forget that in 1964, Johnson said, "I will not send American boys to fight an Asian boys' war." And we all believe that.
Yeah, well, listen, and quickly the political landscape changes. Okay, so how and when do you find out that you're going to Vietnam?
Oh, I was based on Okinawa with the 3rd Marine Regiment, and we began to get some indications of it. First of all, we were all required to go through jungle warfare school.
Right.
That kind of told you something. And then one of our companies in, I think, January or February was sent to Vietnam to do some sort of reconnaissance work and some airfield security work at Da Nang. But even then, we were under the understanding that this was going to be like a 30-day mission. And then all of a sudden, on March 8th, or maybe it was the night of March 7th, actually, we just got the word that we were mounting out, and basically, as the old saying was, is grab your hat and grab your trash and let's go. And the next thing I knew, by that morning of March 8th, we were on C-130s bound for the Da Nang airfield. And that's when I really knew I was going there, that we were all going there.
Is there fear at that point? Apprehension, nervousness? What are you thinking and feeling?
Oh, no. There was just the opposite. It was this kind of almost, well, I won't say celebratory, but kind of a party atmosphere. We Marines were professional soldiers, even if you were in, like I was, for only 3 years. And you trained all the time for combat, and so after a while it's a little bit like being a football player and constantly at practice or at scrimmages but never playing in the game. So this was going to be the real deal, the real game.
I mean, what's funny, Phil, is that, perspective is such a different thing, and generationally, I was obviously too young for Vietnam, but what history taught me about it was that it was just this awful thing, right? Like it was, people were dying, relentlessly and everything else. And so I always ask that question to people because I assume that you guys knew going into a war that it was not going to end well for a lot of people. I mean, when I found out I was first going to the Middle East, I'm like, well, listen, war is bad. There's a chance I'm probably not coming home. So there's a little bit of apprehension there. That never crossed your mind.
Mark, it must have. It must have crossed my mind somewhere, but I can't remember it happening.
Sure. Okay.
All I remember is the 3rd Marines. We were based way up in northern Okinawa, at a place called Camp Schwab. And I just remember getting on the 6-bys to go down to Kadena Air Force Base, which is at the far southern end of the island, and hearing the troops yelling stuff like "Hot damn Vietnam," and goofy stuff like that. So that I really think there was this kind of happy warrior attitude.
Sure.
That we had. And don't forget is that the other thing is that your generation, if I may use the word, had the benefit of mine writing and talking about, and as well as doing a lot of journalism about the Vietnam War. And you guys kind of grew up with that. And the Vietnam War was very different than World War II in the sense of its outcome. Whereas I grew up with this mythology of the invincible American, the invincible nation of America, conquering the world for freedom and democracy. And as I said, my uncles had been in the war, so that and we didn't see that much of the reality of it. As a matter of fact, I would say that we saw almost none of it. All of the films from World War II were sanitized and heroic.
Sure, yeah.
And it was different with the films that came out of Vietnam because, as I said, the outcome of that war was very different, in addition to which the reasons for fighting it were so completely murky compared to Vietnam.
Okay, so when you get there, is there a moment you remember that you realize the hot damn Vietnam kind of mentality went out the window and you're like, oh my God, I'm in a bad spot?
Yeah, I think it was, I don't recall exactly when, but it was a couple of weeks after we had landed, and one of my squads was out on a patrol forward of the Da Nang Air Base or airfield, and my squad leader stepped on a mine that blew his foot off, and that was kind of sobering, to say the least.
Right.
And but still in all, I guess we may have looked at it as almost like an accident, so that I can't say that there was a seminal moment. There were a series of moments. That was one of them. Another one came maybe a couple of weeks later, a couple of weeks after that incident, when our company was sent way out into the bush on a helicopter assault, the first one that we ever made. May have been one of the first ones that American troops ever made in Vietnam. And as the helicopters are coming into the LZ was under some small arms fire, nothing very heavy, just a kind of pop, pop, pop. And after we had landed, we saw that there was a unit of Viet Cong guerrillas up on this ridge line, and they were shooting at us. And so one of our platoons assaulted them, and my platoon and another one went around the ridge to outflank them, and I think we killed 4 or 5 of them. And I remember going through this swamp. They had run into this swamp from us. They were trying to escape up to this base camp they had up in the jungle, and they got caught in the swamp. And I remember going through the swamp with my pistol out, and suddenly almost stepping on this dead Viet Cong who had been shot with a machine gun, and all of his insides were bulging out.
Oh, God.
In fact, I almost shot him again. I was so startled that I saw this face in the bush, and I almost shot him with the pistol, and I saw that he was extremely dead. And we then pushed up into this ravine to their base camp, and I remember we got out a lot of documents and papers and photographs, and we had Vietnamese interpreter with us, and some of the papers were letters to either wives or girlfriends that were, they were rather tender in their expressions. Darling, I can't wait to see you again, kind of thing. And the sudden recognition that this abstraction you were fighting was really very much like you. He had the same desires and same fears. And then I would say that maybe the real moment came in June of '65 when one of my machine guns, my machine gun squad leader, who I really liked the guy. He was a really good trooper. He was a good sergeant and funny. He was a humorist, and he had a kind of loosey-goosey air about him. He wasn't typical kind of brush cut. The Army uses the word strack. They used to use back then, meaning almost somebody like a martinet. He was just the opposite. And he had just had a son born back in Pennsylvania, and he got hit with a sniper, and I mean he was killed instantly. And then we lost a couple of other guys to serious wounds. One sergeant got shot through the spine, was crippled for life. A couple other people were wounded, and that was probably the big sobering moment. But that came after these smaller moments. That this is not a football game. This is not hot damn Vietnam. It's more like goddamn Vietnam.
Well, and to that end, let me ask you, because in your memoirs and in some of your writings after your time in Vietnam, you talk about how essentially, and I'm paraphrasing it here in short terms, but how the government kind of misled. And there was mistrust about the government, about Vietnam. Was that a thought that ever got into your head while you were there, or were you just too busy trying to survive? Because I can remember when I was in my first deployment to Iraq, I was sitting there with another major, and I was lamenting the amount of work we were doing on a daily basis and feeling like no matter what we did, we were never going to be able to give the Iraqis enough training and enough tools to be able to secure their own country, secure their own borders and everything else. And, I remember she looked at me succinctly and said, small victories, Mark. You got to win the small victories. You can't win the big one without winning all the small ones. And I always took that with me. But as an aside, it put me at peace for the moment, saying, you know what? I'm not going to be able to win the war in one shot here. But if I do my job each day, I'll be able to take a small victory. So in that sense, when you think back on when you realize it's, oh, damn, Vietnam, did you ever get into a moment right there you're saying, what the hell are we doing here?
Oh, yeah. I would say, I don't know, maybe after about 6 months, something like that. Not only did I think that, I mean, I heard it from mostly from these veteran NCOs that we had, guys who had fought in Korea, and one of them who'd been at the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, as well as in Korea, and I remember he was a mortar platoon sergeant, and he couldn't put it together. He says, "What are we? What's the mission?" Because the mission kept changing. When we first went there, we were just supposed to secure the airfield. Then we were supposed to secure the airfield, but go on these limited offensive operations. And then there were to be these big search and destroy operations that we were going to take on what were called the Main Force Viet Cong, as well as the North Vietnamese Army. And so the mission kept changing, and I remember, too, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Green, came out there, and I think he was at our battalion or regimental headquarters, but anyway, he made this announcement that our mission was to kill VC. That was it, period. Don't take this hill, don't take this town, don't don't win the war, so to speak. We're just there to kill people, which was kind of baffling. I mean, you know that you kill people in war, but it's usually that's a means to an end, not
right.
the end itself. And so it interested me, and then I saw that get worse in the fall and in the early winter, spring, as we would call it. Actually, as the dry season moved into the monsoon season in Vietnam, and the weather turned absolutely awful. You were just drenched, soaking wet all the time, and guys had immersion foot, similar to the trench foot in World War I, and you were just constantly miserable, constantly slogging around in the mud, and going over the same ground over and over again. You'd send out a patrol. Maybe you'd get in a firefight, maybe not. Come back 2-3 days later, the patrol goes out over much the same ground, and you started to hear grumbling then. And I used to get asked questions as the platoon commander by my sergeants and by the troops themselves. LT, what are we doing here? And I would have to make some kind of inspirational speech about fighting communism and some other nonsense. But after a while, I couldn't even voice that any longer. And what was interesting, this was in 1966. This was a time when back in the States there was a lot of optimism.
Right, sure, yeah.
Fed by the bullshit that the Pentagon and the White House were feeding the American public, that we were winning the war, and we all of us there kind of knew we weren't winning it, but we weren't losing it either.
I mean, it's just when I hear you say stuff like that, and I get it, I understand it. I mean, trust me, I do. I just wonder how does it make it harder to stay alive when all that's going on? Like, is it something that weighs on your decision making? Because politics go out the window the minute the first bullet flies by your head. It doesn't matter what Washington decides. It doesn't matter what Lyndon Johnson said at the time. It doesn't matter if there was a great swell of support for the war. None of that matters while you're trying to save your life and the life of your teammates.
Yeah, but I'm a little unsure of your question.
Well, I guess I'm just wondering. Did the frustration of government stuff make it harder to stay alive on a daily basis?
Well, it wasn't so much the frustration as it was the lack of clarity of a mission. So, for example, from about November to about February, November of 65 to February of 66, my platoon ran so many patrols, squad size as well as platoon size patrols, in addition to company size assaults, that I had troops on patrol actually asleep on their feet. I mean, they were utterly exhausted.
I've been there.
Yeah, I mean, maybe for 1 or 2 hours a night you'd get some sleep, and the rest of the time you didn't. And I think that the fact that they had to just keep these patrols up over and over and over again, as I said, over the same ground, that probably made it more difficult to, as you said, to stay alive and keep your men alive.
Yeah, I mean, and again, just it's similar but not the same when you talk about what we had to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, and particularly for me in Iraq. I mean, I would be on the same roads, 3-4 times a week, 10, 12 times a month, whatever it was, driving in the same direction, going over the same ground over and over again, and facing the same exact dangers day in and day out. And, I always tell people that I felt like there were certain days I woke up and I felt like it was only a matter of time before something really bad happened to me. Like, how many more times can you do this before your number gets called, so to speak? Did you feel that same thing?
Oh, yeah. I felt that, but I had an odd reaction to it, though. You know,
How so?
This is, well, maybe it wasn't that odd. I've actually read enough war books to know that it's happened to other people. So come the monsoon season, it's November, as I said, we're miserable, running patrol after patrol, firefight after firefight. These numbers I'm about to give you are not completely accurate, but they're close. When I joined this one company in the 1st Marines, and when I joined the company, it had a active strength on the rolls of 145 men. By January, we were down to 90.
Oh, damn!
And it was all snipers, small scale ambushes, and what you guys would have called IEDs. We called them command detonated mines.
Right. Yeah.
But basically, you know, claymores, whether homemade or actual claymores. So I got to a point. I said, "Well, I'm just done for." You know, that it's, as you said, only a matter of time before I'm going to get my legs blown off, or I'm going to get killed. And I remember going out on this one operation where my platoon was in support of a different rifle company, and we were actually supposed to act as a diversionary force for this company. We were, in effect, supposed to draw fire. And I was in this, I said, I don't give a shit.
Yeah.
I don't give a fuck what happens. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't care who I kill, and I don't care if I'm killed. And I was in this bizarre mood of happiness.
But you almost feel invincible. It doesn't matter because you've kind of given in to what the end result is, and you just realize if I spend time worrying about it, it's only going to make it worse. So screw it. Let's enjoy where we are, man. I mean, we're in it. Yeah. Let's do it.
That was pretty much it.
Yeah.
It was like I reverted, but in a different sense of the term. I'd have to think about it to define it, to the happy warrior when we left for Vietnam.
Yeah, you know, I saw guys, and then some guys like took stupid chances. You know, like they just went balls out. Like, hey, I'm just going to run straight into gunfire because you know what? Screw it. I mean, the end is coming anyways. Type mentality,
Yeah.
Which I didn't necessarily agree with. I could see the whole idea of feeling a little bit like let me just turn this frown upside down, to put it, very, simply. But I was never a fan of taking stupid chances. There was always a part of me that said, yeah, you know what, let's have a little bit of measured decision making here.
Yeah. Yeah. That's obviously the rational way to go about it. There's some people, there's, by the way, a wonderful poem that Wilfred Owen wrote in World War I called SIW, which stands for self-inflicted wound. And it was, the subject of the poem is this British trooper in the trenches just constantly under shell fire and sniper fire and whatever else they had on the Western Front, who finally just kills himself. Not out of despair so much as he just can't stand the tension of waiting to die anymore, and just decides to get over it. And I think I saw guys, you may have seen them, you indicated that you did in Iraq, who will run into gunfire just to get it over with.
Yeah, because the pressure becomes too much. It gets to a point where it just doesn't matter anymore.
With that sword over your head becomes more intolerable than actually getting killed or badly wounded. Now, as for me, on that operation we're talking about, and it's mentioned in A Rumor of War, is that I took a couple of stupid chances, but not, because I wanted to get it over with or anything else like that. I had this weird, odd feeling that I not only didn't give a shit if I got killed, but at the same time I felt I would never die.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think I described myself as being like a Sioux Indian wearing the ghost shirt that could deflect bullets. And at one point after a pretty brisk firefight, and we were still under some sporadic small arms fire, we couldn't tell where it was coming from. I stood up and started deliberately running back and forth to draw the fire so we could figure out where it was coming from, and I was yelling at the Viet Cong across the river. I was yelling stuff like "fuck Ho Chi Minh" and "Hanoi by Christmas" and this nutty stuff, and I felt invulnerable at the same time that I didn't care if I was vulnerable. It was some kind of weird dichotomy there.
Phil, when you're going through all this, what still stays with you to this day more than anything? When we talk about this, when we start to bring up these experiences, the emotions that you feel and the things that you go through, what still stays with you?
Well, I think what still stays with me is two things. One is I call it an elegiac feeling. Just a feeling that all these guys I knew, 16 guys that I knew, some of them very intimately, have their names on that wall in Washington. So, and 2 or 3 of them were my best buddies. And so I have this feeling of loss and of waste that comes over me now and then. Years and years ago, it used to come over me to a point that, well, maybe it still does, because not too long ago, maybe a few years ago, at a battalion reunion, I went to the wall for maybe the second or third time and just broke into sobs. Mm-hmm. Uncontrollable crying, and that still comes out. And then the other sense is that I don't know what word to use for this. It's a sense of my own personal moral failure in combat. And I'd always thought that the virtue that you had to have in combat, and it is true that you have to have it, is physical courage and the ability under fire and under great stress to think clearly and to know what to do so you don't lose people unnecessarily. It never occurred to me that you yourself could turn into a savage, a monster. Mm-hmm. And I wish I had it here in front of me. And it's been true of war for a long, long time. General Marshall in World War II said something to the effect of about what war does to a person's psychology and what war does to a man's morals, and how it is up to him and his officers to control the beast. He called it the beast in man. And I wished I had read that before I went to Vietnam, because I never it never occurred to me, and I can talk about it now since I've written about it with a degree of removal, a degree of objectivity. But I became something and someone I didn't even recognize.
It's interesting, and as you say it, it's resonating with me, and it's almost like a biophysical response, because look, I've been to the Vietnam War, and I've went there, and I felt it inside of me. I know of a couple of names on that wall, and you just walk it, and you see name after name, and having been through that experience in the Middle East, that breaking down is normal. There currently is right now, as we speak, here on February 6th, there is talks in the works for a global war on terrorism memorial that's going to be built and erected in D.C., and I know a couple of people who are on the foundation and who are helping get the whole thing done. And I thought about myself going to that memorial, and I think about somebody like you going to the Vietnam, and I would expect I would have the same reaction. And the only thing I can come up with is because it's not, look, I came back whole and in one piece, right? It's not even like if you could leave part of your body, your physical body on that battlefield. You could lose an arm or a leg and leave it there. That's not what you're really leaving behind. Your soul gets impacted by combat in ways that you cannot describe. And yes. Parts of you, parts of who you are and who you were before you got there are forever left on that battlefield, and you can't bring them back with you. They stay there, they die there, and you are forever changed because of it. And that is the emotional response. I mean, I don't know. I say this. I left years of my life on the battlefield. I don't know if I'm like literally I'm going to only live to 84 as opposed to 85. You know what I'm saying? But you understand what I'm saying? That emotional toll leaves. It stays on the battlefield, and you never take it back home with you. And none of us ever do. And that is why I think that emotional response is solicited, because just the thought of being back there and going through it again, and I do it in a heartbeat because I still serve. If the bell ever rang, I'd answer. But I know exactly what I'm laying on the line, and it's a lot more than an arm or a leg or even my physical body itself. There's much, much more.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, Mark, that's very well said. I know a lot. Some years after I got back from Vietnam, 10, 12, 20 years, I don't remember now. But I would tell people, and it was true, as I said, I said, basically what happened to me in Vietnam, and I think happened to everybody that was there, at least in combat, was that said you died and were reborn. I said, but into somebody you did not know. Mm-hmm. And I said, and that happened to me to such an extent that I have to this day, at the age of 77, these vivid memories that I know are accurate of Vietnam. But if somebody starts talking to me about stuff that happened before I went there, it's almost as if that was a life lived by somebody else. And I can't remember it. I can't remember stuff I did in high school and college or things like that. And I think when you said that you leave that essential part of yourself there is very true.
Yeah, I mean, war changes everybody in different ways, but undisputably, you are never the same person before you left, and that's just the price that we pay. There's no other way to say it, and civilians will never understand it, and that's okay. I'm not asking them to, but it is part of the civil-military divide that exists, and you know, you're choosing to leave part of yourself there for the guy next to you or the gal next to you. I mean, that's essentially what you're doing. It's about the person and the individual next to you and their well-being. So, I mean, you know, we could wax poetic about this for hours on end, obviously. But let's kind of go to the point where you're leaving Vietnam. When you find out you're going, and what's it like, and what sort of emotions are going through you as you're about to depart?
Well, I remember getting on again just as I landed in Vietnam in a C-130 transport plane, that I left that way with a bunch of guys that were I forgot when you came in it was called a replacement draft, but I don't know, we were all of our tours were up, and we were leaving, and I remember being up toward the cabin somehow where the pilot was and stuff like that. I don't know how I got up there, and looking out a window and just seeing all of these hills of Vietnam falling away, and just feeling this enormous sense of relief and of almost a feeling of being blessed. I was to say I was happy would not even describe it. It was was just like some terrible, terrible burden had been lifted off of me. And I think that maybe I could describe it analogously, is that I imagine a guy who's done, say, 5 or 6 years in prison would feel when the prison gates open and they give him your new suit of clothes and say you're a free man. It must feel like that.
Yeah, and here's the dangerous part, and we just spoke about this, but here's where soldiers get in trouble, because you don't realize when you're leaving, there's such elation and such happiness and relief that, oh my God, I made it, right? And you try to go back to a life of being the person you were before you got into combat, but you don't realize that you are now somebody different. And for some people, they realize it quickly. For some people, they struggle with it and everything else. But coming to grips with the fact that you are a completely changed individual because of combat is where soldiers, Marines, airmen struggle, and why they have such trouble integrating and reacclimating back to normal life. And it's just a you think that, hey, the person that fought in combat stays there, when in reality, the person who showed up before combat stays there, and the new one comes back.
Yeah, well, very, very true. That's what happens. And it's always happened. I mean, I just saw this wonderful, wonderful documentary that this New Zealander did about the British Army on the Western Front. It's called "They Shall Not Grow Old," and toward the end of the documentary, and toward the end of the war, at the end of the war, these British Tommies who'd been over there for years and who managed to survive that slaughter talked about this total feeling of, they didn't use the word, but of alienation from the civilian population and this sense of brotherhood with the other guys who'd been there. And this one soldier that had been recorded back in the 60s, he was then in the age I am now, he was then that age. And he had said that no matter how kind, how welcoming the civilians were, he said you couldn't relate to them anymore. And it was a funny moment that may resonate with you, is that this one guy said that he went back to this factory in 1918 that he had been working in 1915, and there was still this guy working in the factory that he had worked with, and who looks at him and he says, "Hey mate," he says, how are you? Where you been?" and, he had no concept of what this guy had gone through. And I kind of feel, when I think about it, that I loathe the term post-traumatic stress disorder.
Why?
Because it's called a disorder. And I keep telling people, I said, the guy with the disorder is the guy who goes over and he's in combat and he sees people killed, he kills people himself, and he comes back exactly who he was before. I said, that person, I said, is really disturbed.
Right, that makes sense, exactly.
Yeah, and but like you said, and the trying to fit back into civilian society. I remember that after a period of time when I was lucky, by the way, when I got back from Vietnam in the summer of '66, and I still had 9 months left on my military service, and so I was an infantry training company commander at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, for 9 months. So I had that period of transition. I wasn't dumped right back into civilian life, thank God. But even so, when my enlistment was up, my service was up, and I got discharged from active duty, I bummed around Europe and Mexico and stuff like that for like 4 months or something, 5 months. I just couldn't face being back home again and back in civilian life. And finally, just economics forced me to get a job at the 3M company, Minnesota Mining Manufacturing. And I remember I was sitting in the company cafeteria one day after about, I don't know, I'd been there a few months maybe, and all of these guys were talking about the houses. They were young guys then, and they were just getting married, and I was still single. They were building houses in the suburbs. They were talking about their lawns and how the construction of their new houses was going. And I felt so completely out of it. And I said, "Who gives a fuck about your lawn?" And I would think things that might sound kind of self-aggrandizing, but I would look at myself in this company cafeteria, and I said, "Jesus Christ, this is a year ago." I said, I had 200 men under my command, and a couple of months before that, I had 50 men under my command in combat, and I'm sitting here listening to talk about lawns. I was actually ready to ship over, which is re-up in Army talk. Mm-hmm. I was almost said that's reality to me, not this.
So, Phil, how do you transition into being an author? I mean, what's the motivation to start writing?
Well, I think, I may have had an instinct for it even going back into high school. And the thing that saved me from re-enlisting was I got into the newspaper business, which I loved, because in some ways it was very unpredictable. You never knew when you woke up in the morning what assignment you would have, and while I kind of hate to admit this, it was true, is that back in the 60s, late 60s especially, in Chicago, where I was practicing as a reporter, there was a great deal of violence, and I was out with cops. I remember actually one time being out with cops when two street gangs were fighting with each other, and we were caught in the middle and hiding under a squad car, and kind of getting off on that stuff because it duplicated this experience of combat to an extent. But anyway, the newspaper business saved me from it, and I really was pretty damn good at it. So I got used to writing for a living. But what really motivated me was just what we've been talking about, this sense of outsiderness. Most authors, when you read their biographies, have had something that put them outside of their society. Truman Capote, for example, was gay at a time when you couldn't admit you were gay.
Right.
Others had perhaps bipolar disorder or some mental or emotional syndrome that they had inherited, or they'd lost their parents. There was always some terrible wound that they'd suffered. And I didn't have any of that except after I got back from Vietnam, and I felt outside of my society. I didn't really feel like I belonged to American society, and that somehow was the genesis of wanting to write about what I had seen in Vietnam and what I had learned, and it became kind of an obsession of trying to get that experience down on paper. It wasn't exactly what I would call therapy in the classical sense of the term, but I had such a confusion going on in my heart and in my head that I felt this compulsion to make it coherent. bring some order to all of this disorder. And not alone in that, by the way, is that Karl Marlantes, who wrote Matterhorn, this huge novel about Vietnam, he told me that when he got back, he created a thing he called a mind dump, and he just dumped literally everything that was in his head about the war on paper, which with no sense of trying to make order out of it or anything else like that, but it was a way of expelling some of those demons, and he was later able to shape it into this wonderful novel. So I think that that started me off, but the great theme that I've had, not in everything I've written, but in many of the things I've written, is, and I alluded to it earlier, is when a person or people are in a situation or a place or both where the usual guidelines to civilized or normal behavior are missing or very, very vague, how do you make moral decisions? Do you make the right ones? And you are forced back onto yourself and onto your own innermost values. And Vietnam awakened me to that, and I've probably been writing about it ever since. As I said, not in everything I've ever done, but in many of the works I've done.
Well, your first acclaimed memoir, A Rumor of War, it was published over 40 years ago, but at 1.5 million copies. I mean, that's the one that really is the most about your time in Vietnam, and that's the one we referenced a lot here in this discussion. But certainly, I think it's worth it for people of this generation to go back and read that and take a look at it and understand, because look, I am beyond just talking to you has been cathartic for me, just because learning about the experience and understanding that the differences in our generations of combat aren't as dissimilar as we would think. There's a lot of continuing themes that stay together, and certainly hearing you talk so vividly about your memories just kind of churns up memories in my own mind, and we sit here and we go, well, maybe we're not that different after all.
Oh, I think so. It has helped me, and I've read a lot about memoirs of past wars, and as well as histories, and as different as, say, Vietnam was from, World War I or World War II. There is a commonality in experience in battle that soldiers have probably felt for millennia.
Right.
If you'll notice, I think it's this epigram I use at the beginning, of the first part of A Rumor of War, from the Roman military historian of the 4th century, Vegetius. And he says that no great reliance is to be placed on young soldiers for their eagerness for action, because the prospect of fighting is welcome to those who are strangers to it. And my God, that describes the hot damn Vietnam moment.
And to that end, Phil, I mean, Sun Tzu, The Art of War, which was written, 4th, 5th centuries, it still applies today. I mean, everything about it, there's still certain mantras and ideas that we use in combat today that have been holding true forever. So it's the one thing that has stood the test of time, more so than other than the human condition itself. Combat and the nature of war will always be around for as long as there's humans roaming the earth.
I believe so. Even I think in this, it interests me in this day and age of like robotic warfare.
Sure.
I can't recall the title of the film, but I thought it was very good. It was a film with British actress. Anyway, it's a film about drone pilots, and this emotional and moral dilemma they feel 12,000 miles from their target, and watching it in real time, and then it climax. The movie climaxes where the drone pilot has to blow up this terrorist safe house, apparently somewhere, I guess, in Pakistan or Afghanistan. I'm not sure where. But this little girl shows up, and he's got to press the button at that moment. And he's in Missouri, and she's on the other side of the world, and the psychological turmoil that creates. As a matter of fact, I can't even relate. I don't even know what that must be like.
Yeah, it's a whole different world, to say the least. It sparks up in a definitely very interesting conversation. And look, as I said, we could talk for hours more. I would love to give our listeners a lot more, but obviously what we've touched on, I think, is important. And certainly the work that you have done and your point of view from Vietnam has been one that I'll remember for quite some time. This was a fantastic discussion, Phil. I certainly appreciate all your candor and all your honesty.
Well, I thank you very much for asking me to speak to you.
Phil Caputo, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
All right, again, thank you.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.